I used to be involved in a group called Lulzec. I was about 15, 16 years old at the time. And Lulzec was basically a hacking group that existed for about 50 days that made quite a lot of headlines for exploiting very basic vulnerabilities in high-profile companies, just to sort of expose the poor state of security online. Everything from Fox to FBI to, at the end, was the Arizona Police Department was attacked.
I'd like to then ask you a question. What are your thoughts about, various groups like Lulzec and their formation?
I think that big companies should be very grateful that they've been hacked into by Lulzec rather than the Chinese government as a starting point. But that said, I think we do have to be very careful about this issue. Maybe I should start by saying that quite evidently, as you look at me, you'll know that I'm the oldest person in this room, probably by a generation, and I am not an expert on the technologies that we're talking about. However, I have a lot of respect for it. Not so long ago, I went to a primary school in Scunthorpe in the northeast, and I went into a school class full of kids of about 8 or 9 years old in an open plan school. And they had breakout periods, what we used to call breaks in the old days, but they operate a bit differently. And in the breakout periods, these boys and girls all went to a part of their class area, and they were allowed to open drawers, and there was an iPad in every drawer. And they took their iPads, and some of them were playing games on the iPads, and others were doing perhaps rather more imaginative things. And I absolutely support what was said or implied earlier about the potential of young boys and girls in this country who obviously are far more skilled in the operation of computer technology and electronics than anyone of my age, try though I do. So I think that's an important starting point. However, I do have some concerns. Privacy is something that the government has a duty to protect. We are all entitled to our privacy. Stop me if I'm going on too long, by the way, Jennifer. I won't be offended. Privacy is something that we are entitled to protect, even though we are surrendering our privacy faster than we all realise. A little bit of the privacy of the Carlyle family is that because my wife and I both work very full-time, we buy our groceries from an online grocery store, Ocado, which delivers to us and many of our neighbours in Islington, as you will imagine. And when I have to be honest, when my wife makes her Ocado order and books her slot for the Christmas delivery, up comes last Christmas's order. And they say to us, well, don't you want the same as you had last Christmas? This is what you've... Oh, and by the way, you bought such and such a wine during the course of the year, and don't you think you really like this particular wine, so why don't you have some more of it? And when I go on to Amazon and buy a book or anything else of the many things you can buy on Amazon, they suggest to me things that I might like to buy which are connected with my earlier purchases. Now that is a fantastic surrender of privacy on my part, particularly as I know perfectly well that they are probably selling what I have told them to other people for very large sums of money, for which I receive no benefit except possibly cheaper prices when I buy something from Amazon or another online retailer. So we have ourselves to blame for the surrender of our privacy, but we don't realise it. I think therefore the government, and I've been an MP and then a member of the House of Lords for over 30 years now, the government owes a duty to people to protect their privacy. And if I can give you a stark example of the sort of privacy that should be protected, if you go to the phone hacking cases, as they're called, the invasion of David Blunkett's privacy about his private life emerged in court during the Coulson trial as a shocking example of the invasion of the private life of an individual which should never be exposed to public view. Revenge porn, as it's called now, is another example of shocking invasions of people's privacy when clearly there is an implied confidentiality between the people who originally shared the information. I'm very concerned about danger to national security. I was the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation for over 9 years, and there is no doubt that the Snowden revelations have put lives at risk. Now, it's a matter of proportionality in the end as to whether you accept that it is reasonable to put lives at risk because there is a public interest in exposure or not. A very, very difficult question. I see these as enormous challenges, and I think you, and I'm very glad to see there are many people here from the industry, I think you are the people who have to talk to government and meet those challenges. Just one final thing I want to say, and it's about the partnership between the private sector and government. This government, present British government, and its predecessor, and I've worked for both of them, in connection with national security, have found it very difficult to engage with the private sector on these issues. I say to them, if, for example, you want to use the internet to help you to act against violent jihadist radicalisation, there are plenty of people within 200 metres of the Old Street roundabout who, that's a metaphor, but it's also literally true, who would help you, the government, to provide the narratives which need to be out there to attack violent jihadist radicalisation. And I think both government and you in the private sector need to talk to one another much more imaginatively to ensure that we can share the talents which both government and the private sector have and which can be developed in the public interest. And there are going to be some very young people out there working, I think, in the public interest, provided we get that sort of social partnership together.
I think there's a sort of, I sense within these conversations, I tend to spend most of my time speaking at big education summits, and more latterly around technology, because people think that technology is an outcome as opposed to an enabler, and I think there's two different uses of technology in education. One of the things I have noticed, though, is a sort of antiseptic sanitization of what we call creativity. And if we just roll back a little bit on how computer companies got started, especially the ones that are running the internet now, there's only 5 companies really, isn't there, that control our lives. But Apple, for example, was started on the basis of a device called a phone phreaker. A colleague was just reminding me of this earlier. A phone phreaker, for those who don't know, is something that you use to fire tones into a telephone and allow you to make long-distance calls. And the trick was to see how far you could hop using the phone phreaker. This was totally illegal. I mean, this was an abuse of the telecommunication system. Also, Steve Jobs was a formidable LSD consumer. That seems to be erased from Walter Isaacson's book. I know because I took acid with him on Malibu Beach once. It was good. But the point is that, you know, the point I'm trying to make in a sort of jocular way is that innovation tends to teeter along, sometimes go over the line of illegality. You know, it's like piracy, for example, is a big driver of innovation. Anyone who's read Matt Mason's The Pirate's Dilemma will follow that argument. You know, the iPod and therefore the iPhone would not exist had it not been for piracy, MP3, etc., etc., etc. So I think we need to be very careful before we sanitize all our young people and make them believe the world is full of apps. And no disrespect to the opening speaker, but I just think we need to balance it. I have a 9-year-old, or she just turned 9, who, when I asked her whether she'd like to make a computer, this was after I kick-started Kano, or was one of the people that kick-started Kano, as she told me since. I said to her, I was walking down the hill after I splashed out my money, I said, Phoenix, would you like to make a computer? And she thought about this question for quite a long time. And bearing in mind, she had been a beta tester for Sony PlayStation and all that kind of stuff. She was really, you know, she's on it. And she looked at me and she said, I'd rather make pancakes. And I just think the thing is it wasn't about her ability to make computers or code or those things. It was how she saw the idea of making. You know, there wasn't this kind of special thing. I'm not disputing that we should definitely give kids opportunity to experience computer programming or building a computer, but in the same way that they should experience the piano or singing or drama or any number of things. But the point was that her relationship with technology was different. But anyway, the point is the piano arrived on time for her birthday, and we got it out on the weekend. She built it all herself, following the instructions, because like her father, she's impatient. She got into this thing called Minecraft Maker, where you can hack Minecraft. And she got to the bit where you put a bit of Python in there to write something in the middle of your Minecraft game. She wrote, "You're a stupid poo." Now, why has that got to do with the conversation here? I think that there is in a young child the ability to go into the world, the digital world, which is becoming it's a much closer thing for her than it is perhaps those of us are in advancing years. But it was the ability to go in there and change things. And we talk a lot, and you hear anyone from Mozilla drone on about remaking the net and redoing this and remixing it and so on and so on. Do we really mean that? Oh, do we really mean that? Because it seems that in the case of Lulzec, we criminalized young kids, really, and I'm sorry, I don't mean in a patronizing way, but there were young boys and girls who were playing on the internet. They did things, if I was the same age at that time, would I have done it? Damn right I would have done it. It was funny. Some of that stuff was funny. I mean, going into News International at the time when they were breaking laws, just all over the place, and to go in there and plant Rupert Murdoch's fake suicide was hilarious. And I think it was very funny. The question is, at what point, and I think if they were tried today, would Jake have got 3 months in Feltham Young Offenders? I mean, there are real criminals in there. My wife works in there as a psychotherapist, and there are real villains in there. Was that the right place to put him? And would that happen now? There must be a dividing line between stealing a whole bunch of people's credit cards, which you get banged up for, and protest and activism on the web, because that's where our society is going now. Our society is now being conducted in the digital domain. Here, if we've got a problem with a store, we can protest. We can do protest in the street. Well, I think we have to apply permission with this current administration, but nevertheless, we have the right of protest. How do you do that online? And I think, my belief, the way I perceived it, the way I interpreted it, and Mustafa can correct me if I'm wrong, that's how I saw the origins of Lulzec, which was digital activism and protest, and legitimate protest, and they were criminalized for it. And shame on us for doing that.
Wow. Mustafa, do you want to comment on that?
So, I mean, I don't necessarily think that what Lulzec did should be legalized, although I do think the law is very disproportionate on what's prosecuted. For example, I think the law right now, it does a lot to punish hackers, but the way it does it right now, it doesn't actually prevent cyber attacks. For example, I think companies also need to be held responsible for having poor security. For example, if lots of companies nowadays have bug bounty programs like Facebook, Google, Twitter, if you're a hacker and you find a bug if you find a security vulnerability in one of those websites, they will actually pay you for it. They won't prosecute for it. They will actually pay you for it because you're helping them fix their security. So I think the legislation should be such that companies should have a responsibility to protect their customers, and so that all companies should have some sort of program that security researchers are able to submit vulnerabilities and not be scared of prosecution. Because as it stands right now, the law does not just punish malicious hackers, but also punishes legitimate security researchers. A lot of security researchers nowadays are living in fear, and because they can't do their jobs properly, or they can't expose legitimate security weaknesses because of the way the law is right now. For example, a few years ago, there was a case with a person called Daniel Cuthbert, and he was donating to a tsunami relief website one day, and he thought that there might be a vulnerability in the website. So he did a quick test on it. The test basically involved adding a few characters to the end of a URL. But as it turned out, it wasn't vulnerable. But regardless, the admins of that server had picked that up, and they started the case with the police. And in the end, he actually had a criminal conviction for that. He had, I think, a £500 fine as well. But that's completely the opposite of what we should be doing. The law shouldn't be designed to prosecute legitimate people who are trying to help.
Would you like to follow up?
Well, I can't speak for the Director of Public Prosecutions, but ultimately the decision whether somebody is prosecuted is made by the Director of Public Prosecutions. And there are two issues that she has to consider, her staff have to consider. One is whether there is the evidence of a crime, and whether there is a crime or not, and the ingredients of the crime set out by Parliament. And the other is whether it's in the public interest to prosecute. And I think there's been quite a lot of change of attitude over the years. And I would say that if, for example, it was shown that a charity site, just to take an example close to what you were saying, if there was evidence that was found by a benign hacker that a charity site was vulnerable to an extent that people might be able to steal from the charity or might acquire information in breach of privacy, I would be pretty surprised nowadays, in 2014, if the Crown Prosecution Service were to decide that it was in the public interest to prosecute, and their decisions are challengeable as well. So I think that greater understanding is developing, but I don't want to underestimate the problem. Of course, if somebody does find a weakness in somebody's provision on the internet, and they tell the person immediately, it's most unlikely that they would be prosecuted. Most unlikely now.
So that's interesting because I think this was a case from 2006, 2004. And one of the comments that the judge actually made when he was convicted, the judge convicted him regrettably, and the judge actually said this is a case that should not be in the public interest. But regardless, the Met was actually quite happy with the result. And they said this is a perfect example of a good result. But I think that stems from a sort of atmosphere that exists within the policing in this country. I felt like, especially in my case, the police officers, at least in my case, were more motivated by getting an end result rather than making the world a better place. They really over-exaggerated what we did. They called it the cutting edge of cybercrime, and they used all sorts of iconography, like the modern-day pirates in the indictment and that kind of wording. But I felt like, especially in my case, the police officers were trying to sort of improve their career, and they have, because a lot of the people involved in my case, some of them are working for MI5 now. So I feel like they weren't really motivated. They were just motivated by throwing people in jail and getting a conviction for as many years as possible, rather than making the world a better place.
Well, that's something we saw with the Aaron Schwartz case, that it was reverberated time and time again with that case particularly. Another cyber genius that had hacked in and stole documents from JSTOR and MIT. That was in the United States, and he was charged with 13 felonies and over $1 million. And that he was charged with the 1982 computer fraud law that was years and years out of date. So I look at this, and I think, well, are we evolving? Are we learning? Ben, what can you speak as to what we're teaching and actively changing our curriculum and our mental, the way we use words like ethical hacking, which you actually don't like. Really quickly, do you want to say why you don't like the term ethical hacking?
Yeah, I think the word ethical hacking is a bit of a silly phrase, because basically the phrase ethical hacking was invented by white hat security consultancies to sort of make the word hacker sound a bit better, because the word hacker has such a bad connotation, especially in the media and with the average person. So they just sort of add ethical in front of that just to make it sound more reasonable, when in fact you can just call it hacking.
Yeah, I think the term ethical hacking is probably a bit of a misnomer. We may as well just call it the fluffy bunny computer squad and be done with it. Is that more appealing to the audience generally? Everyone like bunnies? It's really interesting that you said about things evolving, though. I mean, I was a teenager in the 90s, and while I don't have any great stories about doing LSD on a beach in Malibu, I've got some great stories about sitting there on my computer, and had my dial-up connection been fast enough, I might well have got involved in more online activism had it existed back then. But technology since the mid-90s, when really the computer boom if you want to call it that, and the internet spread. I mean, I was looking at a graph this morning. Internet use from 1994 to 2014 is just like that on the graph. The technology has evolved really quickly, and the situation we seem to find ourselves in now is that the people that kept up with that are the people that are being punished, and the people doing the punishing are the people that didn't actually keep up with the changes that were happening. And now we've just launched a new computer science curriculum in the UK where so many people and so many organisations are jumping on this fantastic bandwagon of let's get every child coding and let's get every child kind of writing apps and games and doing things with computers because we have a digital skills gap. But I think, as all of the discussions so far this morning has shown, the skills gap isn't necessarily just with people coding, because the people who have been interested in doing that have been doing that whether a curriculum has been there or not. You know, companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google were founded with no computer science education happening at school. Lulzec as organisations were able to form and come together online with no computer science education at school. And it's fantastic that we now have the provision and ability or the legislation for kids to start writing more code. But who educates them on what hacking is? Who educates them on what a security vulnerability is? Who educates the industry on that, the teachers on that? And what legislation are we putting in place to make sure that not only are young people free to write applications and games and all of the things that they want to build with their creativity and imagination, but how many of them are then going to go on and not get prosecuted for finding a security vulnerability in a website?
What do we do about that?
I'd just like to add something else to that. I mean, I think, you're absolutely right. The computing curriculum seems to be a lot about coding, when in fact it should be much broader than that, of course, because it takes more than a coder to make a good game. As we know, it's a team of designers and creative writers and so forth. The other thing, of course, is what I don't see in the curriculum, but I think should be in the curriculum, is for young people coming through, my daughter being one of them, to have the intellectual self-defense, to understand algorithmic bias, for example, to understand that, that Google, the engineers behind Google have a bias, engineers behind Facebook have a bias. There is bias in the system, and why wouldn't there be? In exactly the same way there is in any media. But to understand how their digital world is mediated by those biases. And if one was cynical, one might imagine that we don't want them to understand what's behind the curtain on some of these things. And I'm thankful for organisations that, like Lulzec and so forth, that every now and again wake us up out of our slumber and remind us. And it's only going to get worse. I mean, this sudden fetishization of wearable computing. I mean, the more invisible technology becomes, you speak to anyone in Silicon Valley, I mean, they obviously don't get out of Palo Alto enough. It's kind of like, we want to make the technology invisible, then we've succeeded. The problem with that is then we don't know the stuff that is being mediated. We don't know the bits that it hasn't digitized, because the assumption is it's digitizing everything. No, it's just digitizing what it can, the quantified self, not the unquantified self. And I think once it's become invisible, then it becomes even more dangerous. And I think we have to encourage a young generation that are coming through this curriculum to understand those very real, very real concerns that we have. I mean, when you get to a point where the digital economy is concentrating the wealth to an ever smaller number of individuals and companies. And I'm talking about 5 companies in particular now on that control the internet effectively. Then I think we have serious issues. And it's, we can get into taxation or something. It's interesting, we were talking about criminalizing young kids for messing around on the internet, and yet we have these very large corporations running around not paying tax and having very convincing schemes for avoidance. So I think there are much bigger issues around that. I think that's something that we need to equip young people coming through the education system to challenge.
And just on that, I mean, it's not just the technology that has evolved over the past 2 decades. If you look at the late 20th and early 21st century, the entire model of the way that civilization kind of works in the Western world has been flipped on its head. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, we were very much used to being told things. We were being broadcast at. We stuck to the BBC's programming schedule because that was all we could do. We got our news from radio. People were telling us things. It wasn't an interactive forum in the same way that the digital age that we live in now is. But that's not just the only part of things that have changed. In those days, we lived in a society where everything came from the top, where the people who were older knew better than the people who were younger, and the people who were older had more experience than the people who were younger. And so when it came to people setting laws and prosecuting people, because they were older and more experienced and in a position of power, that meant that they knew better than the people who were younger and being prosecuted. And it's the same with a lot of these big companies as well. Just because you're a large company and you're playing by some of the rules doesn't mean it's okay to not play by all of them and then get annoyed when a teenager exposes a security vulnerability within your company. We don't live in the same world that we did 50 years ago, but a lot of the infrastructure in place around education and legislation hasn't caught up.
Can I just raise a couple of other public policy points as well? Intellectual property. I think that as a matter of public policy, the laws governing intellectual property need to be simplified dramatically, because there are now, when I was a kid, it was unimaginable that somebody of 14 might have dreamt up an idea, produced an idea which could be patented and turned into a huge intellectual property success. Now it's plainly imaginable. Indeed, it's happening. Young people are, in some of those schools, are capable of thinking up new computer-based intellectual property, and I think it's very important that they should be able to retain it. Otherwise, it will be totally consumed by the 5 large companies, or maybe slightly more companies you referred to, which leads me directly to my next point, which is about competition. I used to be one of the chairmen of something called the Competition Appeal Tribunal, which is the British antitrust court. And I have a real concern about the anti-competitiveness of the industry we're talking about. When worldwide there are less than 10 companies dominating the biggest industry that the world has ever known, which has brought us the new industrial revolution and so on, I think there is cause for concern. And there may well be a strong case, as a matter of public policy, for forcing these very big companies to break up, just as, for example, we forced the airports to break up, meaning that the same company no longer owns Gatwick and Heathrow airports. Because I think we will have a much fairer, leveler playing field for people who have brilliant things to do in this industry if we remove those public policy obstructions.
On that note, I'd like to open it to the audience. Does anybody have any questions? Lord Jim Knight.
I said that I was older than everyone else here by a generation. I hadn't spotted Jim.
Thank you, Alex. And the question is, to some extent, geared to you, Alex, more than others, in that you were the independent scrutineer on anti-terrorism legislation for those 9 years. And I guess as a fellow legislator, one of the things that perplexes me is who to believe when we're asked to legislate around privacy and national security. And you are in the perfect place to give us some reflections on how we keep open our legislative framework so that people can innovate and probably be around the edges of what is legal in the way that Graham and Mustafa talked about in order to help us progress and still be relatively secure.
Well, I suppose the simple answer to that question, Jim, is how long have you got? This is a very, very important issue. And, you know, I was called into I was in Madrid one day and I was asked to go to a newspaper editor's office big newspaper editor's office on my way back to the airport. And he took a piece of an English newspaper which had a big attack on the government by one of the civil liberties NGOs. And he said, what's wrong with England? In this country, meaning Spain, we might have given it a column inch in a side column in our newspaper. Well, I absolutely applaud the fact that we have such an open situation in this country in which secrecy is under attack all the time, because it's actually very dynamic and demanding of government. That said, you've got to trust somebody. And, you know, Jim and I are both members of the House of Lords, and we both have a lot of experience in political life. And actually, I hope you would agree, Jim, that Parliament is not as malignant a place as it's made out to be by many people in the media. Actually, it's full of rather hard-working people who do their best for the public they either represent, or if you're like us, you've been put in until you're carried out in a box. And I think we have to the answer to the question is we have to go on strengthening the institutions that check on the use of national security. The Intelligence Services Committee has made tentative steps towards becoming more public and accountable. It's now a committee that reports to Parliament, not to the Prime Minister. That may not sound like a big step, but if you compare it with what has happened in other countries, then actually it's fairly big. Another example is that we have various scrutineers, most of whom are retired judges, all older than me actually, who are given the job of looking at interception, for example, and checking it on a continuing basis. But I think we've got to wake up to the fact, and I say this with great respect to those retired judges, because some of them are actually my quite close friends, that this is no longer a job for retired judges. This is a job for people who understand the technology and are able to scrutinize it with resources on a much larger scale than is the case at present. What we absolutely cannot do, I'm afraid, interesting though it would be, is open up national security to open scrutiny. We have probably, and I speak from several years of very close contact with them, we have probably the most cohesive and effective intelligence service in the world, and it does some very good things. As long as they're properly scrutinized, we need them, if only to check on the intelligence services of other countries which are doing some quite bad things. But they do need to be accountable. It's not a very satisfactory answer to the question, because it does involve trusting the people who do the scrutinizing, and that's very difficult to accept, but it's necessary.
I'd like to ask why. Why wouldn't the whole access to the information be available?
Well, it's the answer to that is very simple. We have, let's call them secret agents, and they're not people who ski downhill in a dinner jacket with an unspilled martini in their right hand. These are people who are doing some pretty horrible jobs out there to, for example, protect British embassy staff around the world. And if we expose what they do, then we expose them to danger. One of my closest and oldest friends was the person who ran the last generation of British spies in the former Soviet Union, at a time when the Cold War really meant something and there was a danger to our safety from the Soviet Union in those days. And I think, if we'd had open season, we wouldn't have had any spies. We wouldn't have had the information that protected us. Now, I suppose in an ideal world, we wouldn't have any spies. We wouldn't need to do all that, but we don't live in an ideal world.
I was going to ask, don't you think in some way that the intelligence services and, for example, GCHQ are in some way sort of undermining all the technology that programmers and developers and innovators are creating? Because I think the sentiment very much within the tech community is that, well, we've spent so many years creating all this technology to improve people's lives, and now you've got a bunch of people secretly abusing it and undermining it. And now there's a whole sort of movement to sort of revisit all that technology from scratch and implement encryption and security to keep the people who are abusing it, to keep them out.
Well, I think there's a premise in that question that I do not accept. Having looked very closely at UK security for a number of years, although in any large organisation there will be failings, just as there are failings in the private sector, I don't believe that there is evidence that British security services have, on any large scale, abused the authority that's been placed in them. That's just not right in my view, and there is no evidence to support it.
Well, I mean, there's quite a few cases of where questionable GCSU has done questionable things. For example, like the hacking of a cryptography professor in Belgium by basically targeting a ISP in Belgium called Belgicom in order to target a professor. I mean, I don't see why you would target a professor, a cryptography professor. I don't see how that he's not a terrorist, he's not a pedophile, he's not doing anything legal. So I don't think it's okay to target him. That's just one example.
I think I've come across some very dangerous professors in my time, one or two of whom were pedophiles. I mean, I think there are literally. I recall that the pro-vice chancellor of Bath University was sent to prison, a past one, for paedophile offences. And, you know, I can't comment on individual cases in Belgium. What I do know was happening in Belgium, as it happens, is that the illegitimate Bangladesh terrorism trials, war crimes tribunal, was actually using people in Belgium to write their judgments for them, people who had not heard the evidence in the case. So, you know, I think it's very difficult. There's always a factual response to an assertion like that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you know, you can't comment on individual cases. I mean, that's understood. But I think you have to at least accept there's a general feeling amongst the citizens that technology can be used, both, you know, that people can be undermining the technology to expose people when it suits them. You know, I don't think it's too stretch of imagination to imagine the Secret Services will carry information on people which they can release should they want to. It seems like a perfectly legitimate intelligence action. I think there's also the opportunity for technology companies themselves to undermine democracy. We saw that recently with Facebook, who were playing around with their algorithms to change emotion, how we felt, by adjusting the algorithm on postings. I mean, if they can do that, then surely it's possible to undermine democracy to their favour, for example. I mean, there are some concerns around this, surely, at a policy level.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, if you look at what's happening in, off the top of my head, the internet in Iran, for example, insofar as it's available in Iran, and that, of course, is the issue, really. In China, in certain parts of China, at any rate, there are undoubtedly ways in which democracy, or polity, because they don't have democracy in the places I mentioned, can be interfered with by the use of electronic media. And we have to be vigilant about that. But, you know, this is like electricity in a sense. You know, electricity is entirely benign unless I happen to dip a light bulb that I'm holding in a bowl of water or stick my fingers in the plug socket, and then I get electrocuted by it. And just as we did with electricity, and it actually took a very long time, over a period of decades, life moves more quickly now, it became possible to ensure that we have a happy balance between the dangers of electricity and the benefits of electricity. The same has to happen with the internet. It's a very clumsy metaphor, I know, but it illustrates the point. And, you know, I think we cannot have a situation in which there's open season to everything, because that puts my medical record. I rattle with pills. I'm very healthy as long as I rattle with pills. But I don't want you to know which pills rattle me in order to keep me healthy and vigorous. And, you know, once we have open season, you can look at my health records. No, thank you.
We're approaching that, though, aren't we? I mean, isn't there the selling off of medical NHS records, the metadata, apparently? That's already happening.
Oh, I agree.
And what happens when we start, you know, an app company thinks, oh, I think it'd be really clever to take people's health records and their DNA screening and their school records. I mean, you could completely do the Aldous Huxley there, couldn't you? You could map out the entire education provision, the health provision, housing provision for a whole population of people based on some clever big data. Because there's a whole bunch of people out there that believe big data works. I mean, it's frightening, but they actually believe it works and it's useful. And I think that, we're seeing that happening at the moment. I mean, certainly the mantra around big data and algorithms and analytics, it's almost like a religion right now. And I think there's some concerns. So I think your pill rattling might catch you out.
Well, I absolutely agree with what you've just said, but the problem is, being in my mid-60s, once you get involved in the detail, I haven't a clue what you're talking about. And that is a real problem, because I don't trust things about which I haven't a clue what you're talking about. I either have to understand it, or I'm very suspicious of it and I want it controlled. And you have to recognize, just as we in the Westminster Village believe that we know all that's going on in politics, but I used to be the MP for Montgomeryshire in mid-Wales, actually we don't know what people are thinking in Llanfair Caerenion. Equally, you, brilliant though you are in this industry, you actually don't have a clue what people in Llanfair Caerenion are thinking about your industry. And believe me, they don't trust you. At the bottom, they don't trust you. They'll use you, they love your kit, but they don't trust you to protect them. And that's the job of politicians and the public and of public policy. And you have to live in that real world.
They don't trust you either.
No, I quite agree. I quite agree, I mean, I answer to my conscience, but I don't expect people out there they used to vote for me in quite large numbers, but I recognise that didn't mean they trusted me at all. They just thought I could solve their problems.
All right, I want to ask you in the back, thank you for being patient, in the top right.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Schindler. I'm at the law firm Kingwood Madison, S.J. Bowen. A couple of observations and one question. First of all, an observation. You mentioned, Lord Carlisle, that your data is used and sold to other people, and this is the reason why you get advertising targeted at you. Well, if you're not informed about that and you don't consent to it, then that's a breach of the Data Protection Act. And in fact, Google have been taken to court successfully and served after jurisdiction because they were doing that. So the law actually does protect you there. That's point number one. Second observation, big data. We do have big data. It does work. If all National Health Service records anonymously are made available to top researchers, universities, pharmaceutical companies, I think we'd all be in a much better state of health in 10 or 20 years. It's all about anonymity in that situation, and data protection laws protect that. That's exactly what they do.
Can I come in on there?
Well, can I make my final point, and then you can come back? My final point really is a question to Lord Carlisle. You say that the laws of intellectual property need to be simplified. Well, we're dealing now with an ever more complex world with all this technology. They don't need to be simplified. They need to deal with all the sophisticated things that go on in the technological world, and that's why they can't be simplified. And the 14-year-old who invents something can get a patent for it, or he can protect it in other ways, and there's no rule that Google or Facebook can come along and nick it. So I don't really understand that point.
I'm in a strong position to say, if you forgive me, typical bloody lawyer. I
thought you'd say that because you're a politician.
Yeah, well, I'm a lawyer too.
Well, I know that.
But
former,
which, is two of the least popular professions in the known world. Now, first of all, on the question of data protection law, the problem about that is, and this, you're making a good lawyer's point, but actually the public haven't got a clue how they're protected, which means they do not know how to protect themselves. The protections that are given to individual members of the public when their privacy is invaded, for example, by revenge porn, is very clunky indeed, and they are in despair about it.
Well, the criminal law is there for that.
Yeah, as many yes, but you know how slowly the criminal law operates.
No.
I'm
not a criminal lawyer, but it's been all over the papers. Anyone that doesn't know now that revenge porn is almost certainly a criminal offence and suffers it is not reading any of the newspapers. It's all over the front pages.
You're showing what you've just said, that you're not a criminal lawyer, because revenge porn is not a criminal offence
that's
at
yet
the
to
moment.
be tested in the
Parliament
court.
is going to make it a criminal offence in due course. Now, on the other point about intellectual...
Well, actually, can I disagree with you on that? Could I disagree with you on that? Because serious breaches of the Data Protection Act is a criminal offence, actually, and it's be a strong argument, I haven't actually seen it in any commentary yet, very strong argument that revenge porn is a serious and flagrant breach of the Data Protection Act because you're processing someone's personal data without their consent.
Well, there hasn't been a single prosecution on that basis so far.
Well, there should be.
So, you know, well, maybe, but it just shows what the state of belief about the law is, if not the state of the law. Just one other point I wanted to make in reply to you, which is about intellectual property. Of course, intellectual property law is bound to be extremely complicated, and perhaps I didn't make myself clear. I'm talking about the gateway. I'm talking about the gateway into intellectual property protection, so that clever young, or it may be old people, maybe when I retire I'll get up to speed on all this wonderful stuff, should have easy gateways to protect their intellectual property, because I do not believe that it is being adequately protected at the moment.
Well,
and it's very costly as well, you know.
Well, no, that's not true, actually. Any software program that's an original work is protected by copyright. Do you know how much it costs to protect copyright?
How many of you have had an intellectual property case recently that's cost you next to nothing?
No, you're talking about litigation. Do you know how much it costs to protect your copyright, to own a copyright, to register a copyright?
Yeah, I'm not talking about registering. I'm talking about enforcing it. You know perfectly. You've got to be realistic. You're beginning now to grate. You have got to recognize that if a small person who has made an invention tries to enforce that, and I actually recall very clearly having a constituent when I was an MP who was faced with this problem with a major motor company. If such a person seeks to enforce their intellectual property against a huge company, they are going to be eaten alive by the economic forces of that company, unless they're lucky enough to find an altruistic lawyer like you who's prepared to act for them for next to nothing.
Well, there are law firms that will do that. And also, I think we need to increase legal aid for those kind of cases. So that's an example where government can help.
Are there other questions? Yes. Russ.
He was asking what was going through my mind when I first got into it and what was my mindset like. Well, everyone in Lulzec sort of came into it from a different aspect and different mindset. But my personal mindset was, it sort of started out as politically motivated hacktivism. So, well, going back, actually, this is a bit relevant with what Alex was saying. But I used to be a user of the Pirate Bay, which is a sort of piracy website. And I was just sort of inspired by the fact that this was a piracy website and they knew what they were doing was illegal. But despite that, they believed in what they were doing and they made every effort to not get shut down and not to sort of bow down to any legal threats. So that was sort of like a motivational sort of activism standpoint. And there was a point where the Motion Picture Association of America had allegedly hired an Indian software company to launch distributed denial of service attacks to shut down the Pirate Bay. So I first got sort of heard about Anonymous and hacktivism when Anonymous retaliated by launching a denial of service attack against Apex themselves, sort of giving them a taste of their own medicine. When it went too far was with Lulzec, because before Lulzec started, I was just involved with Anonymous, and that was everything back then was completely politically motivated, and at least in our minds ethical. But when Lulzec came about, that Lulzec wasn't politically motivated at all. Although it became politically motivated near the end during an operation called Anti-Sec, which was a sort of campaign against policing and governments. And one of the leaks, the final leak that Lulzec did, was a leak from the Arizona Police Department. And that's when I think it went a bit too far, because potential lives could have been at risk back at that time. But that's why Lulzec was disbanded, because there was a disagreement over that leak.
Question over here.
Hi. A couple of people have mentioned anonymized or metadata related to sort of health or NHS data. Anonymous data isn't actually enough to protect people's privacy, as the case of the New York taxi drivers sort of highlights. There aren't actually that many New York cabs, so when you start releasing hashed or tokenized taxi IDs, it's actually still not that hard to work out who they were. And I'm not entirely sure if those who are making decisions about releasing this data to third parties necessarily have the technical skills to decide or determine whether the anonymization that they're putting in place is sufficient to protect against very sophisticated and bright people working out who these guys are in the future.
I think that's a good point, and because there are people that believe big data works.
Are there any other questions? Guy.
Just want to go back to the question about sort of when it's in the public interest to prosecute and what sort of tests should be used to sort of determine when as a sort of hacktivist, is it criminal or is it just like any other form of activism? And I guess for me, the issue comes down to harms. In almost any other sphere of life, if you go and break something and you harm something in an actual protest, if I go like trash Fortnum & Masons in the sort of riots or something, that's criminal damage and that is actually kind of a harm. Why shouldn't a similar test of sort of harm apply in the, sort of the digital space? So even the example you sort of joked about of the Rupert Murdoch obituary on the Sun website is in fact a sort of a harm to the sort of the Sun's website. It is diverting potential ad revenue. It's potentially putting off customers, etc. Whatever it might be. And so, in terms of how we prevent children being criminalized or whatever else, rather than looking at sort of process, like compromising a system, which I think is how some of the laws are currently defined, some of the anti-hacking laws are currently defined, which got people like Jake in trouble, make it about harm. So if you steal data, if you prevent commerce, which is a real harm.
Alex is going to know much more about this than I do, but I'm just going to stick my 2 pence worth in anyway. I've always, I mean, as an activist of the old school, so I was a sort of, throwing bricks into McDonald's and wearing a balaclava. I think there's an awful lot, a lot of the law seems to be about protecting property and business and not citizens. I mean, you say, like, well, they lost some commerce, they lost some advertising. Well, so what? That's legitimate protest. I mean,
well, no, but if you want to be
a villain. I mean, the phone hacking, they were villains. Do you know what I mean? And
well, so no, it's not up to you as the citizen to...
I'm just giving an opinion before Alex gives a much more professional view on it. I just think that, the legal system is wrong both in the physical world as well as the digital world. So what I'm saying is that I take the point that you're saying, but I'm saying the law is wrong in both cases. I mean, the UK Uncut protest on Fortnum & Masons, I think, was legitimate. And yet that it was attack on property and business,
so I guess,
and therefore, and that's my opinion.
So my question, Mustafa, actually, when you were saying about the mindset, did you know that some people were doing was illegal, but you just chose to do it anyway because it was activism? And I guess that's right. Like the people who protested outside sort of nuclear testing facilities during the Cold War knew what they were doing. They're going to get arrested, but they were doing it because it was the right thing to do. But so the law is arguably right, and you're breaking the law. So where's the problem?
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, I knew at the time it was illegal, but we sort of saw it as civil obedience. So, yes, it was legal, but it was also a form of activism. And in civil obedience, you're taking that risk and you're accepting that you might get arrested. But I think it's also interesting that you mentioned the criminal damage, because one of the people from Lulzec, he's Irish, and it was one of the first, if not the first, hacking case in Ireland. But because in Ireland there aren't any strong, or even if there is any hacking laws, so they could only prosecute him under criminal damage. So they couldn't find anything to prosecute him for hacking except for criminal damage. And because of that, he got a very light sentence because, well, he just changed a few things he changed a few files on a server. It's not much damage. So he was sentenced. He didn't even get a criminal sentence for it, a criminal record for it. His sentence was a €5,000 fine and community service, making the website for a charity shop.
I mean, interestingly, there are a few kind of common themes between all of these questions that I've been sat here listening to, and between some of the answers as well. All of these issues tie back into a number of things like privacy, and also the fact that technology is now so readily available and so easily available for everyone. Everyone can go and buy a smartphone or a laptop. Everyone can get access to the internet. The good guys and the bad guys, if you want to categorize it as that. And we could sit here and debate what is good and bad until the sun comes home. But I mean, our lawyer friend may have to close his eyes for a second, but how many people in here have actually torrented something before or downloaded something off the internet not legally? And, I'm stood here in front of cameras, but yeah, I've done it. I mean, who hasn't done that at some point in time? And that's technically theft, but would we class that as theft in the same way as walking into a shop and walking out with a stereo? Do we count damage by altering a few files on a website that can be reverted from a backup later because somebody left their front door unsecure?
property damage or criminal damage in the same way as throwing a brick through a McDonald's window, because I'm guessing you really wanted a mayo chicken. But there are so many differences between the way that the world operates now and the way that the world used to. Everyone has access to this technology. As Lord Carlisle said right at the start, people give away their privacy, sometimes without even knowing, sometimes without even thinking first. And if we can't be confident as citizens in current legislation and the people that currently write that legislation to understand the technology behind that, then why should citizens not try and highlight those things by highlighting security breaches or creating some kind of digital activism that helps highlight those issues?
Well, I agree with every word of that. I really do. And I think it's extremely well put. Just on the issue of prosecution, I know more about this than I should, because you mentioned 2006 earlier. Between 2008 and 2013, there was a sea change within the Crown Prosecution's attitude towards the exercise of its discretion in relation to the public interest. This is not to criticise Sir Keir Starmer QC's predecessor, but Sir Keir Starmer QC, who was DPP for that period, and Alison Levitt QC, who was his principal legal advisor, to whom by chance I happened to be married. No, not by chance. Sorry. I misstated that. But to whom I am married, I should have said. Please don't tell her if you meet her that I said that. They actually, very seriously, brought about a sea change in two ways. First of all, there was a presumption against prosecuting people under 18 if there was not any harm in what they'd done. Then there was a presumption not to prosecute anyone over 18 if there was no harm. Sorry, I lost you. If there was no harm in what they'd done. The harm principle, which you described, is exactly the same as the public interest test, which has been applied as interpreted by the people I've mentioned, and as is now being interpreted by Alison Saunders, the current Director of Public Prosecutions. Courts are now extremely critical. Judges are far more robust than they used to be, where there are prosecutions where there is no harm and where it was not in the public interest to prosecute. That is not to say that it doesn't happen. I can give you some awful examples, particularly in the prosecution of children, not for computer-related offences where it has happened, but I can put my hand on my heart and say a genuine attempt is being made to avoid that situation. Gary McKinnon, for whom I campaigned against his extradition to the United States, I believe would not have been prosecuted in the United Kingdom. Indeed, actually, I believe he could have been prosecuted in the United Kingdom under the existing British law, because the acts that he committed were committed in his bedroom in the United Kingdom. And it was a situation in which the United Kingdom was not prepared to prosecute domestically. It took far longer than it should to stop the extradition, and it was done, in my view, on grounds which were an excuse rather than the reason, though I was very happy with the result. But I don't think that the situation is quite as bad as you're implying. Indeed, I think it's a great deal better now. And if you come across cases where that is proved not to be the case, tell me, tell Jim Knight, or any other parliamentarian, and of course we will investigate it for you as best we can.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here.
It goes like this. I mean, there is no patch for ignorance.
Welcome you.
How many of you had heard that before?
It is an equality problem.
And protest, and legitimate protest.
Hey, way to school me. I just showed you how to increase font size, so don't forget the old school hacker here.
Viva Innotech, folks. And forward with all your deliberations. Will that do, Jennifer? Can I go now? Thank you very much.